I married her for reasons that could be written in columns, liabilities on one side, assets on the other. Her name, if names can ever be owned, catalyzed introductions, invitations, ledgers closing. I said yes because it was a sensible purchase, and sensible purchases have the clean geometry of receipts and signatures. I had before her a modest account of myself. 3 debts, 2 habits, 1 saving grace, an even hand with numbers. She had a house that was a photograph and a reputation that paid dividends. We folded the margins of our lives together the way one closes a book, carefully, with the spine aligned. The house arrived with shelves and fixings already in place, the pool set like a black lens beyond the dining room, the parlor mirrors hung at angles that favored flattering photographs, the candles grouped on the mantel so that when they leaned, they did so like careful witnesses bowing in unison. There was a notebook in the hall, leather-bound and blank, a thing apparently placed for guest notes, but which I appropriated as my own. I began to keep an account. My ledgers were small rituals: breakfast at 7:15 if the clocks had not been retuned for daylight savings, tea at 3:30 exactly, steeped 3 minutes and no longer, the ring laid face down on the bedside table on Thursdays. They were not meant to prove anything outward so much as to prove to myself that the days could still be counted. A habit is a kind of receipt. You look at the stub and know the purchase was real. The house answered us in details. It remembered the way she folded the napkins for charity suppers, the way she wiped a single spot on a glass with the corner of her palm. It remembered my coat hung in a particular place in the back alcove, which meant it remembered that one might always return. A house that remembers is both comfort and accusation. The first wrongnesses were small and so easily dismissed I could have let them pass. The kinds of errors that friends call eccentricities and spouses call quirks. A mirror would answer a moment late. You would lift your hand, and your reflection would follow one breath behind, as if the glass took its time remembering what you had done. At dinner, a spoon would ring thinly instead of dull, a sound like a coin against crystal when no coin had fallen. A shorthand note I had scrawled, a list to remind me of the solicitor's visit, reappeared on the kitchen counter with the handwriting slightly too tidy, with the slant of a scribe. I began to catalog. The ledger became its own narrator. Some entries were practiced jokes for myself, small tests of attention, but, like a conscientious auditor, I also logged the things that could be used against me when the books were examined. Ledger, July 6th. Mirror lag, 2 seconds. Tea left 30 seconds past steep. Napkin folded at charity supper, wrong side out. Ledger, July 9th. Coat knot in alcove. Keys in bread bowl. Her purse on piano, though we had agreed. 3 weeks ago, purse in closet. At first, such notes were comforts. Proof that errors happened and therefore that we were still alive inside the precise choreography. Then they multiplied. She moved through her social life with the same curated precision as the rooms. Charities wanted photographs, acquaintances wanted soft laughter, clubmen wanted to be remembered. She gave them what they wanted the way a craftsman provides a product, polished, measured, consistent. Publicly, she was unruffled. Privately, she was a series of decisions, each one accounting for what must be obscured and what must be shown. The first time I noticed the replacement properly, noticed him for more than a glance, I was in the kitchen lining up my pens as if arranging bullets. He arrived in the way low-importance things do, carrying timber. A man with a crate of wood should be a man with a crate of wood and nothing more. Utility does not usually announce itself as poetry. But there was a way he held the crate that suggested one accustomed to standing in other people's porches and being noticed. He bore a resemblance to me not in the casual way cousins might resemble, but in that smaller, more particular, dangerous way. He wore my jawline as though it had been borrowed. His hands were too neat for work, his shirt ironed, the nails clean. When he spoke, "My name's Thomas," he said, handing over the wood. His voice fit over the corners of my sentences like a glove. I told myself nothing at all at first. Men of convenience and transactions come and go. He carried the wood in and stacked it in the hearth with a care that suggested someone who had either learned or been taught domesticity. He took off his gloves on the mantel and left them there, identical to a pair I owned. A mirror in the passage caught his reflection, and for a beat, the glass answered late the way it had been doing lately. When I looked again, he had gone. But he had not entirely gone. There was a ledger entry in my handwriting, one I recognized because I write my H with a particular flourish, on the kitchen table after I'd left it in the drawer. It was a note I had planned to write that evening, and then somehow had written in advance. Remember to call solicitor, mortgage, present plan. I had not written it. Or perhaps worse, I had without noticing. The distinction seemed important for a week. I began to test. Not like the childish tests one plays on lovers, leave a forgotten scarf, send a teasing message, but methodical checks that would, if passed, prove a continuity of self. I left my keys on the mantel and watched from the study window. I placed the coin from my father's pocket into the sugar bowl and noted its place. I read aloud the ledger entries before bed. If any one of these things failed, then the ledger would be falsified. He failed in small, inconvenient ways that were human enough to be devastating. Once I watched from the window and saw him put my keys in his pocket as if he had picked them up to move them out of the way. Another time, on a night the three of us had guests, charity donors with lace collars and small expectations, he voted with his fork for the fish when I had meant to decline it. He raised a glass at the camera and smiled in a way that put his teeth where mine would have been. The photograph, cropped later in the magazine, made it appear as if I had not been at that side of the table at all. There were also things he did not do. He did not make mistakes that mattered. He did not miscalculate a donation figure. He did not forget the solicitor's name. He did not leave the gate unlocked. He was initially a mercy that cost me fewer sleepless nights. When the mother came, my mother, who still had records of accounts and grudges and a folder labeled for emergencies, she did not accept miracles. My mother had the air of someone who expects life to be propitious only if managed, and when debts present themselves, they prefer creditors who can be persuaded with clear arguments and paper. She visited the house the first winter after we married. She walked the rooms the way an auditor walks ledgers, slow, hands folded, explaining the seams of things under her breath. She noticed the man who carried wood with an expression that suggested she was cataloging ways to use him. "You are looking well," she said to my wife, which in her tongue was a way of saying you are properly presentable. To him, she said nothing more than, "Wood?" and he produced an invoice as if by instinct. My mother kept the invoice and filed it into her handbag with the careful, triumphant movement of someone who keeps things in order. I could see the arithmetic in her face. A man who can produce receipts may as well be treated as a line item in a balance sheet. He began to appear at events. Not always, but often enough. He held a baby at a charity launch and looked as if he had always been assigned the role of supporting actor. The club men liked him because people like people who do not surprise them with contradiction. He had an elegant competence that read as reliability. He did not drink too much and he did not say the wrong joke. He wore my cut of coat registered exactly in the same way, as if tailored from the same pattern. Photos that once showed only one man in a suit were slowly altered by presence. The camera liked him. I began to find, in my pockets, receipts for dinners I had not paid, and notes from solicitors who claimed to have met me in rooms where I was certain I had never been. In each place the mathematics of my life shifted a sum of itself toward him. One evening I told my wife I had noticed these things. She listened to me as one might listen to a storm report, calmly, with the knowledge that weather can be predicted and managed, that forecasts are for the prudent. She did not deny. She sat with her hands folded and gave me a reason that was neither confession nor evasion, but a decision. "We were running out of time," she said. "The bills were mounting. The club was talking. The solicitor wanted assurances. You were working late. You were—" She glanced at my ledger, and I felt like an account being read aloud. Distracted. I asked for help. "Help?" I said, because ledger language is blunt. "You asked someone to replace—" "Not replace," she interrupted, but not unkindly. "Supplement. Appearance matters in our circles. Appearances pull money. A man who can stand in a room and take a photograph." She tapped the glossy paper on the coffee table. "He can buy us time. He can remind people we are stable." She looked in that light like someone stripping a painting of its dust. Her hands moved without ceremony. I held my ledger against my ribs like a shield. Was I consulted? I asked. She smiled then, and it was the old smile that used to make me think debts might yet be repaid. You were consulted in the ways that matter. You were told, if you want to be called, you will be called. Otherwise, her voice loosened. Otherwise, we keep a tidy life. There are words that raise a house of cards. Tidy life is one of them. It means smooth surfaces, no stains, no embarrassing mistakes. It means someone else absorbing the crooked edges of existence. It means the public ledger looking clean while the private one balances differently. I do not think I argued, or perhaps I did in ways that left no marks. What I felt was less like indignation than a peculiar domestic bereavement, the sense of being gently erased as if someone took an eraser to the margins of my days. When one's gestures are replaced by someone who looks like you and smiles like you and learns to answer for you, the problem is not only the theft of face, but the theft of error. Mistakes are the small proof of life. Remove them, and you are left with something too smooth to be convincing. She had reasons, she said. There were letters from people she had known since her 20s. There were half-promised gifts that dissolved unless shown immediate attention. There were the club votes, the charitable calendars. She had feared collapse. She had arranged a man who could be her companion in the performance of domesticity. I wanted us to last, she said. I wanted a life that didn't have to fight at every step. It was a plea that sounded like a tender ledger entry. Protect the principal, preserve the long-term interest. I listened and made entries. My ledger does not judge, only accounts. Ledger, September 12th. Wife, wanted us to last. Note, listen. After that, the house began to fold him into its memory as if he had always been part of the furnishings. He learned the tea schedule almost perfectly. He placed the sugar where she liked it and never stirred too long. But he had failures that were not theatrical but small, and therefore painful. He would always button his coat the wrong way on Wednesdays, as if he had not learned the simple orientation of domestic garments. He would leave the door ajar at precisely dawn, the hour when the house likes to keep its last breath of silence. He once misread a name on an invitation and sent apologies in the wrong hand, and yet he made other things right. He paid a bill that had sat in my stack for weeks and had become a stew of nervousness at night. He arranged a meeting with a benefactor who had been slipping away. He complimented at the right moments. He was an arithmetic of presentation, a man who could turn an uneasy ledger into numbers that obeyed. It is strange to catalog jealousy, because jealousy itself is a ledger of a different sort. It measures desire against lost hours. My jealousy did not make me violent. It made me attentive. I began in more earnest to test the seams. There are several ways to test a life. I chose modest, precise measures. I left a bruise on my palm where I could feel it in quiet. I misplaced a cigar in a drawer where he would be apt to find it. I recited a sentence in the morning that I planned to mildly contradict at dinner. I watched for the slackening of performance. When he failed, I catalogued the failure as currency. When any small human error happened, spilled tea, a burned thumb, a miscounted check, it felt like a coin returned to my pocket. Once I watched him stand by the reflecting pool at the back of the house. The pool is not a cheerful thing. It takes light and answers with a truth that can shock. It refuses flattering angles, preferring to hold the world with a sober eye. He stood there with his hands folded, and the mirror of water returned him faithfully. For the first time since his arrival, I saw a slight hesitation, as if the surface of the pool questioned him, and he had not fully learned how to answer. I had been keeping a list of proofs of life, a private litany. It is a peculiar, almost superstitious ledger. The bruise on the wrist, the mislaid key, the coin in the sugar bowl. Each entry was an attempt to draw a map of who we were by the accidents we bore. I read the list to myself when sleep would not come. Proofs of life, misaligned shoes, tea spilled at 3:32, ring rotated once a week, handwriting slants vary. He did not at first create these proofs. He could, in his competence, eliminate small humanness. That was the cruelty. A man who removes error is in fact removing evidence of being. The social consequences were immediate and not wholly unpleasant. The solicitor called less often with threatening voices. The newspaper columns softened their edges. There were dinners without the stiffness that had crept into our home, evenings when people with small wealth found reasons to stay until the last course. My mother stopped visiting so often, which was a kindness in its own way. But relief has a cost. I began to accumulate a different ledger, one that counted the weight of presence against the price of being replaced. I counted hours I had not been in photographs, sentences I had not finished in rooms where someone else had concluded them. I catalogued the small ritual absences, a diary entry gone uninked, a cigarette extinguished in a jar I did not recognize. It is a particular grief to be unremarked in your own house. The pregnancy found us in the spring, when the house was beginning to loosen its winter tension. She came to me in the middle of the day while I was sitting at the table, aligning my pencils as if they were a line of soldiers. There was no announcement, no dramatic flourish. The news arrived in the same measured voice she used to discuss menus. "I think," she said, and paused with a way that made me open my ledger to hold her words like a receipt. "I might be pregnant." I remember the way rain fell later that afternoon, not in sheets but in polite applause against the windows. I remember seeing my own face in the mirror answer a little late, as if reflection itself were unsure how to receive the information. The house seemed to hold its breath. Candles leaned a fraction closer on the mantel, perhaps to listen. We tested with the modest privacy of a life that keeps clinical things clinical. The first test was a morning ritual, a small paper strip that could be read as a binary answer. We waited in a bathroom that had always been dear to her for the way the light fell at 9. The reflection in the glass was the room's usual polite witness. When the line appeared, there was a silence that was not yet comprehensible to ledger terms. A positive result in domestic arithmetic does not present itself with immediate clarity. The house did not shout, it hummed in the way of well-tuned radiators. We went to the clinic because certain things in life require professional witnesses. I sat in the reception area tallying the magazines by date as a way to contain myself. She held my hand in the corridor with a loose, practical grip, as if we had agreed on a method of walking through the world. They placed a wand against her abdomen, not in the intimate way of private touch, but as one might place an instrument on furniture to check its integrity. The image on the screen was not figurative but an echo, shadows that might become light, a small blankness that could be read. The technician was a civil clerk of flesh and possibility. Her voice was neither celebratory nor condemnatory. "There's a gestational sac here," the technician said, and for a moment, the words were like a line item on a balance sheet, neutral, factual, pending. The image on the monitor was a gray suggestion, the kind of abstraction that invites projection. We received the nurse's pamphlet and a list of next steps. There were instructions about vitamins and schedules and the phone number of a counselor. There was no immediate answer to the ledger question that occupied me like a small corrosive coin. Who exactly would be counted as the father? We did not speak of it in the clinic, but later in that evening, with the house moving its familiar furniture of shadows across the rooms, we sat at the table in the yellow light and traded small practicalities: what to eat, when to announce, whether to call the mother. Each answer pushed the ledger in one direction or another. "Who do you think—" I began, and then stopped because the question was not one easily answered by logic. Parentage is not a simple entry in a book. It is a claim on future days, on names and health and blood, on who will stand in photographs with a small sleeping body. The very thought of images thrust me back to the photographs where his hand sometimes rested where mine should be. She looked exhausted in the way of someone who's been calculating in private. "I am not certain," she said. "I thought—" She let the sentence hover, like a feather. "I thought it might be yours. We have been close in ways that mean something." She swallowed. "And also," she touched the edge of the napkin as if to fold it into a confession. "And also, there have been times he has stood in your place. I thought, perhaps, he could be the father." There was a list I assembled then, in darting notes, as if by writing rapidly I might trap something alive. The list became a litany of complications. Ledger, April 21st. Pregnancy confirmed. Uncertain paternity. Factors: timing of intercourse, dates of substitution, appearances in bed, who warmed the blanket, photographs, public acknowledgments, emotional variables, shame, relief, grief, love. The thought of paternity being ambiguous created a new kind of arithmetic. Lineage is one of the oldest ledgers we keep. Name, father, mother, each a column in the account of identity. To suggest that a line might have been authored by someone whose origin cannot be fully named changes the debts owed to both history and imagination. We did not tell anyone at first. Announcements can be managed, curated. My mother, who keeps records, would have been a problem precisely because she writes the kind of letters that scare benefactors away. The club would have wanted a statement. The solicitor insisted that there would be legal implications: inheritance, registration, the specter of gossip that could be weaponized. I spent a night composing possible phrases in my head that might reduce scandal to a manageable fee. Saying "we are delighted" seemed a good line, but falsified something. Saying "this is a difficult time" would invite pity and then questions. My ledger filled with possible sentences, each weighed and then crossed out. It is worth mentioning, perhaps, that pregnancy in a household like ours has both public and private economic consequences. A child can be a social investment, a family continuity that mollifies donors, a reason to solidify trusts. But it also becomes a liability in the rawest sense. The mother's time changes. The household must reassign duties. The insurance questions must be attended. There is room here for a species of calculation that is both pragmatic and cruel. She, for her part, did not flinch from the consequences of her choice earlier. If anything, the pregnancy magnified her decisions into sharper relief. She told me, at one point, that she had felt no shame in arranging assistance because she had been steering us away from bankruptcy. "I wanted to keep us from collapsing," she said again, as if repeating an accounting principle would make it true in the ledger. "You did it to spare us," I said, "because the ledger needs language to articulate its balances, and also because I wanted to say that I understood and yet felt something trailing away." "I thought," she said, "that if a child comes, continuity will be obvious and forgiven. People forgive those who can produce heirs, whether they deserve it or not. They will look at us and see a family. They will not invoice us." The words were honest in the way of persons who have to make decisions that are both moral and tactical. I did not know whether to admire or resent her. I added the moment to the ledger as if it were a financial transaction and not an event of love and fear. In the days that followed the clinic, I watched the replacement with a new attention. The house, for its part, watched back. Its motifs, candles leaning, pool ripples, mirror lags, tracked the uneasy weather of our home. Sometimes the pool answered him with perfect fidelity. Sometimes it hesitated, as if it were waiting to see how he might misplace a towel or burn his thumb. He did not, and in that was a new problem. She named practical things: when to tell the mother, who should accompany her to the next appointment, what to do if charitable events collided with prenatal care. She spoke about the possibility of consulting a nurse at home. She spoke about names with a curious mixture of cynicism and tenderness, names as future brands, names as family ledger entries. It was in this conversation that I understood the depth of the change. A child would make the substitution permanent on paper. Photos would be taken. The man who had filled in my face at dinners might become a man in those photographs with small hands on a small sleeping body. It was a possibility that curdled me. There were nights when I dreamed ledger entries turning up incomplete, columns unbalanced, decimal points misplaced. I dreamed of the replacement standing at my study window, writing numbers that were not mine. But dreams are not proofs. They are warnings. The proofs are things like burnt toast, a receipt paid, a hand that forgets. One afternoon, somewhere after the confirmation and before the public reckoning, I found a note shoved between the pages of my ledger. The handwriting was mine, sort of, and not mine at all. The slant was similar, but the pressure lighter, the loop on the G tighter. It read, in a list arrangement, things that I had been thinking of aloud. List: call mother, call solicitor, prepare statement, consider truth, consider music for ceremony. Remember, mistakes are currency. I carried that page like a compromise. Its existence suggested that the erasure and the authorship were becoming entangled in a way I could not easily separate. I went to the pool that evening with the page in my pocket. It had been raining in the polite way, and the water's surface was mottled with small concentric rings. I stood at the edge and looked at the reflection of the house, which in the pool became a kind of ledger of light. Windows like entries, candles like footnotes. The man who carried wood stood on the terrace, hands in his pockets, and the pool answered him precisely. The mirror of the pool did not lag for him. For a breath, I thought the house had decided. Perhaps it had chosen the person who would continue to be remembered. I do not know what I expected in the way a man expects a check in the post, a legal affirmation that would correct a mistake. I had been taught by numbers to trust paper and signatures, but the world is not only receipts. It is the sound of tea knocking over. It is the way a ring can be found in an impossible place and thus demonstrate error. We sat later in the parlor with the curtains half drawn. She held my hand as if we were partners in a small, precarious conspiracy. The replacement moved through the household with a growing facility. He was learning, like a child, like an apprentice, the vital arts of being human. He began to leave small things out of place on purpose, or perhaps because he had begun to adopt the truth of error instinctively. A shoe slightly skewed, a misbuttoned coat, a note half scribbled. He miscounted napkins at a charity supper, and apologized with such exactness that the donors smiled indulgently and forgave the mistake as though it were a charming slip. It is one of the strangest graces of life that the capacity to err can redeem one in the eyes of others. A man who can blush or burn his finger is in some ways more believable than a man who never does. The house seemed to note this. Sometimes in the late afternoons the mirrors answered him slowly, as if allowing him the grace to be imperfect. Other times they reflected him with that earlier fidelity that unnerved me. I kept writing. The ledger grew into a diary of small deaths and mercies. Ledger, May 2nd. He spilled tea at 3:31. Public forgives. Ledger, May 14th. Mother called. Asked who was at bedside. I said we. She did not press. She filed it away. Ledger, May 20th. Ultrasound next week. Consider names. Consider that the father may be someone whose origin is ineffable. The word ineffable is useful when one wishes to avoid ugly specificity. It is a kind of ledger language for mystery. It deducts without naming the creditor. I used it because the replacement's origin was precisely that, something the house implied rather than declared. There are many expressions one might use, mechanical, spiritual, foreign, but none of them would do. The witness we had was domestic, not forensic. Small mistakes, burnt bread, a misshelved book. These were the things that might humanize him. The moral problem persisted. There were nights when I thought of the child who might be born into a household where parenthood has already been negotiated partly in public and partly in quiet arrangements. Who would be credited on a birth certificate? Who would be honored at 21 with a speech and a toast? The legal consequences were as heavy as the private ones. The solicitor had, in an oblique way, hinted that the simplest path to security was to name a father who had the necessary social standing. There are transactions where truth is less important than continuity. There are deeds penned to ensure that properties do not enter into dispute. She, who had introduced the man to the house in the first place, did not seem to relish the idea of wrestling with a ledger that asked for a single name. She wanted stability. She wanted us to be a family apparatus that others would not challenge. That meant choices would be made, and choices require courage and sometimes small betrayals. One night, in a fit of clarity I cannot now claim to have summoned entirely by will, I asked her plainly if she would lie. The question sounded cheap in my mouth, like a petty line imported from a writer of tawdry dramas. "Would you lie about who the father is?" I asked. She put her hands on mine, the way someone who wants to prevent a falling thing from breaking might. "I would protect this family," she said. She did not say lie. She said protect, which is to say she would select, choose, arrange for the continuation of the accounts. We did not decide then. We delayed. Perhaps we delayed out of decency or fear. Perhaps we delayed because, as the body of her altered, we felt the passage of time differently. Days measured not only in tea and ledgers, but in small, internally shifting rhythms. Bouts of nausea, a sudden craving for salt in the night, the way her sleep shifted. The house grew tender and jealous at once. The mirrors leaned forward to look and then turned away as if embarrassed by their own interest. It was in this fog of private arithmetic that the first truly human proof occurred. Not planned, not tested, but the sort of clumsy accident that proves a thing beyond dispute. He burned his hand on the kettle. The kettle was hot because the tea had been left on while he argued politely about which vase to place on the dining table. He cursed under his breath, a fragile, private sound that was not part of the curated performance. He wrapped the hand in a dish towel and limped to the study, and for the first time I felt my ledger tremble with a new line item. Proof of life. Burned hand. Evidence that the imitation could be injured. When I saw the reddened skin, I felt a mercy so sudden it startled me. The man who had taken my place in some photographs had, for a moment, become vulnerable. He made a sound of surprise, quiet, not showy, and I moved toward him without thinking, because to attend to pain is a domestic duty as old as houses. He looked at me then with something that could have been gratitude or calculation. His gaze lingered, and for a moment it was impossible to tell which. She watched us from the doorway with an expression I could not read. There were no proclamations, no epiphanies. The house continued to be a barometer of small things. The mirror answered us late that night, as if reluctant to be complicit in any narrative that might paint us as wholly restored. I recorded it. The ledger must be kept, if only to remember the weights of the days. Ledger, June 3rd. Burned hand. He winces, Mercy noted. Consider implications. There are, at this point, several moral calculations one could perform. One might choose to demand that he leave, to reclaim the photographs, the chairs, the places where one has outlived assumption. One might choose to accept the child's arrival, to baptize the ambiguity in a bath of future kindnesses. One might choose to demand names, to require legal clarity. Each choice is a subtraction and an addition. Each choice will have consequences not only on the public ledger, but in the secret economy of nightly small mercies. We did not choose. At least, not yet. The pregnancy continued, both in its practical appointments, vitamins, ultrasound dates, a list of allowed fish, and in its accrual of future possibilities. She rested more and more, and the house rearranged itself to accommodate the new schedule, cushions placed where they could support her back, the kettle set to be less hot. The replacement continued to learn, misplacing keys at times and apologizing with enough shame to be recognized by donors as humanly fallible. The house adjusted in its own way. The mirrors sometimes favored the original reflection, sometimes the borrowed one. The pool answered in ripples whose timing suggested the house itself had not yet decided whom to remember. Candles leaned differently on certain nights, perhaps because the hearth had learned to hold more than one light. There is an economy of mercy that arrives slowly, like interest on a small deposit. You discover after weeks that you have become fond of someone who once stood opposite you as an adversary. You begin to notice their ways that are not stolen but learned, their little errors that are not mimicry but the accidental birth of being. I found myself noting these with a ledger that had become softer. Ledger, June 22nd. He laughs too late at a joke, his laughter small and true. Account. Kindness grows. It is the strange thing of our house, of all houses perhaps, that the presence of a child promises both continuity and complication. A child's arrival is both a line item and a weather event. It redistributes daily obligations and reshuffles grief. I do not know, and the ledger cannot predict, how we will come to measure the child. The question of paternity hangs, a notation with an ellipsis. This is where I leave off for now, with the house leaning in its private ways, with the candlelight thin and the ledger heavy with entries that are part accusation, part love. The man who carried wood has begun to misplace things, to burn fingers, to laugh in ways that are not quite practiced. She moves through the house with a small and complex happiness that does not erase the past. I continue to observe, to count, to record. The pool watches us and sometimes answers late as if unsure which of us it should reflect first. There will be more entries. There will be decisions. For the moment, the house holds us. The tidy life we purchased, the quiet economy of our gestures, the quiet mercy of a burned hand, and waits to see which ledger will be heavier in the end. If you have followed this far and find the slow account compelling, consider staying with the tale. There are further entries to be made. Ledger, July 2nd. He laughs at a joke he does not yet know. Account. Laugh plausible. Note. Observe. After the burned hand, the house rearranged itself with the slow courtesy of people who have been given time to forgive. It was not a sudden clemency. There are no dramatic reconciliations in rooms that remember every draft, but a weathering, an accumulation of small concessions. The mirrors, which had sometimes answered him with the cruel punctuality of instruments, began to falter in different places. There would be evenings when they favored my face and evenings when they favored his. Sometimes they favored both at once and answered us with a slight stutter, as if surprised to be asked to hold more than one truth. I escalated my ledger tests with what I told myself was scientific detachment. I left notes I would not have expected him to write and watched to see whether he would fabricate a plausible script. I placed a coin from my father, thin with a nick at the rim, on the piano and hid behind a drape to watch if it vanished and where it might later reappear. I wrote a sentence in the margins of my ledger, something mildly exposing, and left the open book on the armchair of the study to see if he would add a correction or a flourish. He did not invent, he learned. That, perhaps, is the most disorienting thing. Habits trapped within someone else can be taught, and taught in such careful increments that it becomes hard to say where imitation ends and adoption begins. He began, over weeks, to pick up the same little inefficiencies that had once marked only our house. An asymmetric placement of the butter knife at breakfast, a tendency to fold napkins with an inside corner showing when he was tired, a habitual pause before he spoke the word we, as if measuring it for a ledger. I watched these things and added them to my book with an oddly tender hand. The solicitor visited again as the pregnancy advanced. She sat behind her blotter and presented possibilities in the language of mitigation and contingency. Most couples, she said, tapping a sheet with bullet points, name a registered father. It simplifies estates, it simplifies trust concerns. If question arises in the papers, social continuity tends to mollify it. It is, at times, a practical decision rather than a rhetorical one. Her prudence was a species of weatherproofing, wrap the house in the kind of paper that cannot be pecked away by gossip. The matter, she added, can be handled privately. There are precedents. Precedents. A ledger of generations, each line item a compromise. I listened and made entries. There was a clause about guardianship, a clause about medical authorization, a paragraph about the naming of the father for the purposes of legacy. Each phrase felt like a small removal, an erasure performed with ink and signature. Ledger, July 16th. Solicitor, recommends naming a father for legal ease. Note, consider cost of truth. My mother called less and with more caution. She had an economy of such calls. First, assess. Second, instruct. Third, remove herself from direct involvement until an accounting could be made. When she did visit, it was short and strategic. She was not given to tenderness in public. She measured with the glance of someone attuned to line items. You are looking stable, she told my wife one afternoon, which in her dialect was an assessment and not a compliment. She did not, on that visit, ask who exactly had been standing in rooms and taking photographs. She asked instead whether contributions had been secured, and whether there were any outstanding obligations that required her attention. She had learned, in the long habit of keeping ledgers, that pity is expensive and that careful investment is cheaper. If the solicitor spoke in cautious clauses and my mother in arithmetic, the house spoke in a language of small accidents. Charities gave us grateful letters with marginally warmer phrases. Donors lingered at events. At a garden benefit in late summer, the replacement stood toward the edge of a photograph and was handed a baby briefly. He accepted as if he had rehearsed the minimum movements of holding a child in public. The Donor Society's newsletter printed the image with his hand on the infant's shoulder and a caption that read, a family engaged in the city's welfare. The caption was an alchemy that turned a complicated truth into a neat headline: engaged, involved, family. There was a small cruelty in how easily the world accepted him when he performed the right rituals. People forgive the illusion if it makes their own accounting easier. They will overlook whose hands were in the pastry if the table looks right and the invitations are written. I watched these concessions with a bitterness that sometimes tasted like gratitude. He paid a bill that had sat unpaid for months. In return, donors stayed. In return, social obligations smoothed like old leather. The calculus was effective. Yet the private arithmetic of our nights continued to be more complicated. There were mornings when I would stumble into the bedroom and feel a small, jealous pang at the way she slept. The tilt of her head, the soft curl of her fingers, the way the blanket lay over the place she had left to warm. I would sometimes find the replacement scent on her sleeve and record it as if noting an anomaly in the tax ledger of attachment. She, for her part, did not become a caricature of cold calculation. There are moments I still think of when the woman who organized prizes for benefit auctions would, alone, take out a small boxed thing from her bedside drawer and hold it to her chest, as if to give herself courage. I found her once, late, at the sewing table, needle threaded, a tiny square of blanket folding in her skilled hands. She was making something small and secret, a swaddling cloth, but not the kind purchased from a boutique. This one had the faint smell of lavender, and she stitched a single motif into the corner, two intersecting rings like an imperfect Venn diagram. I sat in the doorway and watched the motion of her fingers. "I sew for when it's small," she said without looking up. "For the first nights. For the smell of home." There was a tenderness in her voice that was not calculation. There was, too, a stubbornness to her that I had long admired and long resented, the will to create something beyond the immediate account. She spoke to the blank nursery wall as if to an audience, not in theatricality but in a practical practice of making room. "I suppose," she added, "we will have to decide about photographs." She was asking yes, but also naming the problem aloud. She moved in the world by making small rooms and conditions. There was an economy to her tenderness that obliged me to respect it. We began to make private rules, necessary compromises drawn up in the margins of our conversations. If a photograph must be taken, perhaps he will stand to the side. If a donor insists on a family portrait, perhaps the child will be placed between spouse and me. We designed phrases for public consumption that contained enough vagueness to cover our choices. It was a pity that language often functions as a kind of insurance, a well-turned sentence that pays for a quiet misdeed. And yet there are limits to such contracts, which is why the pool ritual became, as it were, inevitable. Not inevitable in the sense of a scripted drama, inevitable in the way that people eventually seek a small proof to anchor a fragile truth. For me, ledger-minded to the marrow, the house's memory was a witness that could be appealed to in acts rather than just in words. A mirror can reveal a lag. A pool can refuse to lie. I do not pretend that I believed the water to be a tribunal. I only believed that ritual matters in houses that are used to having their histories scrubbed. She agreed to the ritual not with a fanfare, but with her usual practical poetry. "Call him," she said one evening, when the light fell like an apology across the dining table. "Call him as if calling a neighbor. Say his name and ask him to be human for a moment." The language was careful. She did not command me to demand anything of him. She proposed an experiment disguised as a domestic nicety. The pool was chosen because of its peculiar honesty. It never flattered the profile. It returned things with an economy of light. If a man had learned to mimic our gestures only on the surface, the water would have had a way of showing where lessons had not yet taken. We stood that night by the pool. Candles leaned against the dark mantle of the house in the background, their flames small and watchful. The air smelled of rain from the morning. The terrace tiles were cool. The replacement came when we called him, moving without fanfare. He seemed to understand he was needed, not as an intruder but as an apparatus. There is an execution in his practice, When assigned a role, he does not ask whether he is suited to it. He simply prepares himself to perform. Thomas, my wife said. She chose a name, and the choosing itself was a minimal sacrament. Come here. He crossed the terrace and haltingly stopped at the pool's edge. I watched the water take him and return him back with that same crystalline honesty I had come to respect. It mirrored his face exactly. There was no lag. The pool had until then sometimes faltered on his reflection, sometimes not. That night, it returned him steady as a coin. For a moment, I felt that my ritual would fail and that the ledger I kept would have to start capturing a more complicated calculation. Just stand there, my wife said. Look at yourself and tell us one thing that is wrong. A small thing, nothing grand. The request was precise and odd. There are few tests like asking someone to confess beforehand to a small error. It is an invitation to fallibility. He blinked as if this exercise had not been presented to him in rehearsal. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, uncertainly, I once left a child's kite on a rooftop when I was small. I never went back for it. It was not much. It was not even necessarily true. It might have been a script performed to meet the demand. But the telling had the quality of a memory that made his voice hitch on the edges. The pool answered with a ripple that could have been wind or could have been our breath. Again, my wife insisted, soft and steady. Tell us another mistake. A present one. He looked at my wife for a long moment, and I watched in the ledger of my face the confession I had not yet written. Then he reached out and took a small ceramic ashtray from the rail. A trivial object, one that had sat there for years as if placed by arrangement, and dropped it. The ashtray chipped on the terrace tiles. A shard of blue chipped free and skittered across the stone. He made no pretense of clumsiness. His hands had not practiced breaking porcelain. He said, with a slight wince that might have been discomfort or calculation, I did that. The shard lay between us like a sudden coin on a counter. It was a tiny proof, and the house took note. For the first time in months, there was a little howl of surprise from an instrument that otherwise was discreet. The mantel clock, a proud thing, clicked late. The candles leaned as if to look. I felt the ledger in my hands tremble, as if in the presence of a deposit. He burned his finger soon after, an old kettle left on low in the study, and cursed quietly. I moved to help without thinking. The touch of his skin, reddened and honest, made me register a gratitude so sharp it felt like a theft. He apologized with a stutter, then laughed at himself in a way that was not practiced. Mercy entered in small gestures, the offering of a bandage, the silence of attendance, a spare tea poured without ceremony. The change that followed was not dramatic, but accumulative. He began to misplace things more often. Keys, spectacles, an umbrella, always the small items that demonstrate the kind of human forgetfulness one cannot fake without losing something else. He miscounted napkins at 2 dinners running. He apologized with such visible shame that our guests forgave him as if charm had settled the balance. He left a smear of jam on his cuff and did not immediately wipe it away. He left a towel on the floor overnight and, in the morning, looked at it with the puzzled expression of a man who had only just learned such disarray could exist. The house adjusted to these new kinds of evidence. The mirrors sometimes answered him a moment late. The pool sometimes showed him with a ripple, as if it too were second-guessing. I recorded each event in my ledger with an attention that had softened. There was, hidden among the pages of observation, a sense that perhaps humanization is less a miraculous conversion than a slow curriculum of error. Ledger, August 9th. He knocks over vase in morning. He blames self. Note, pity noted. I tried in those days not to gloat. Pride is an unsympathetic currency. The sight of him apologizing for a trivial misstep tasted like the payment of a debt I had not expected to collect. There were moments of real tenderness that had nothing to do with accounting. He sat by the edge of the nursery chair while my wife rested, his hand unconsciously smoothing the blanket she had made, his voice a low, unsuitable baritone crooning a tune that missed notes but had the right rhythm. The sound was not practice. It was an accident of rhythm, like the misapplied stamp of a childhood memory. There was an ultrasound later in the second trimester that remains among the ledger's heavier pages. We sat in a dimmed room while the clinician navigated the screen with cool competence. The image was a constellation of shadow and light, a shape, a flicker, an echo that, even in its abstraction, struck us as small and wholly immediate. "There is a heart rate," she said without fanfare, and the words landed like coins, steady, convertible, irrevocable. The technician printed a photograph for us, a grainy oval full of suggestion, and we took it home as if carrying a new account book. The photograph hangs now on the fridge with a magnet fashioned from a charity pin. I found myself imagining lists of names. We made odd rules about announcements. We drafted a short statement that would be used if necessary, and another statement, less practiced, that might be read on the day of a christening. We discussed guardianship in dry legal terms, and then fell into a silence that was not merely procedural. It was intimate and awkward both at once. There was, not surprisingly, a ripple through our social circle. Some friends sensed nothing and continued to invite us with the same breezy generosity. Others, perhaps through a smell of newness or a whisper creeping in from a service elevator, began to ask questions in quiet corners. There was a photograph in a society column in which he leaned toward my wife with a small official smile. The caption read, "A household awaits new life." It was true, but not entirely. My mother, in a manner that only someone used to keeping records can manage, softened in increments I had not thought possible. She began to send, through her assistant, small parcels: a shawl for winter, a carefully folded blanket with clean seams. She wrote a line in a letter, only a line, that read, "We will stand by you." It was not a full measure of affection, but it was a deposit in the account of obligation. I put the shawl over my wife's shoulders one evening in the parlor. She smelled of lavender and something else. Soap, perhaps, or an unplaceable newness. And for a dreadful second I imagined how the world would read her if the photographs were taken with him in the frame. There is an oddness, however, in watching a thing become plausible to others. If the world can be persuaded of a continuity by the right photo, what does that say about truth? My ledger answered with a mixture. Continuity soothes the social ledger. Truth rests elsewhere, if it exists at all, in the bed of private, small mercies. I learned to inhabit both books at once. The months accrued like interest. There were nights when my hand would stray to the place in which the ring had once been placed face down on Thursdays. Its rotation slowed as if to mark the strange calendar of decisions. Sometimes it was face up, like a coin offered to chance. I longed for errors to return to me in a way that made me sometimes absurdly petty. I would leave a cup of coffee in places he might conceivably forget, and then feel satisfied when it sat cold into the afternoon. What kind of man keeps such talismans? I do. I learned of my pettiness and wrote it down. Ledger. October 1st. Ring found face up. Note: small pleasure. Add: avoid grand gestures. My wife, who had orchestrated the introduction and who now moved through the months with a kind of quiet endurance, had moments where her face betrayed a private weather. We would walk through the nursery and she would run her fingers across the blanket, smoothing or roughening the stitches as if checking the truth of their existence. Sometimes she would stop at a nursery rhyme and whisper a line as if testing the sound of it against the walls. Once, while I was making a list of hospital clothes, she took my hand and said, almost conversationally, "If he is the father on the paper, will you write his name?" The question itself was a ledger entry: who will be named to keep the book straight? I hesitated because the hesitation felt like cowardice or prudence depending on my mood. "I'll do what you wish," I said finally, because a marriage, at its base, is a series of promises made in ink and in small daily compromises. She named a series of improbable hypotheticals, 2 names, 3, with a dryness that had the edge of someone rehearsing a speech. "If paper must hold one name, let it be the one that offers continuity," she said. "But you will be present. You will be the one who changes diapers at night. You will be the one who reads." It was an odd bargain she offered. Name in public whose paper will say one thing, claim at home what belongs to both. I accepted, and perhaps that is the most unsentimental thing we did. We made a plan that would be interpreted by others as sensible and by lovers as a compromise. There was a night near the third trimester when everything seemed to compress toward the shape of our small decisions. The rain came, and the house sighed with the sound of old wood settling. The candles on the mantel burned taller than usual and leaned inwards as though engaged in private conversation. We sat at the table while the clock measured its steady, indifferent hours. "My ledger," I said at some point, and she laughed because she had seen it. She had watched the way I wrote and the way I took notes like a man who wishes to keep wounds from being forgotten. "May I read?" I handed her the book. It is a curious thing to watch someone read your account of a life. They see your pains and your petty gratitudes laid bare in small script. She paused at entries where I had noted the small things she had done, mending a collar, folding a blanket, and her mouth softened. Then she skimmed to pages where I had catalogued failings and confessions, and her face shifted as if weighing salt. "You keep count in case you forget what to forgive," she said, touching the page as if it were a small altar. Perhaps she was right. Forgiveness, in our house, had been converted into a kind of accounting that could be tallied and returned. We were two people, and perhaps a third, learning how to sustain a private polity in a world of public ledgers. The ritual at the pool, the burned finger, the chipped ashtray. These had not healed all wounds. The novelty of his errors made him believable but did not erase old resentments. There were nights when our talk turned fractious, not in raised voices but in the careful trimming of sentences. "Do you think," I asked once, a little late, "that a child can undo what has already been rearranged?" She looked at me as if asked to answer a theorem with a warm glove. "No," she said, "but it can complicate the arithmetic in ways that make neat columns less useful." There is truth in that. Children do complicate arithmetic. They insert variables and dividends that do not reconcile neatly. They also, in their impossible capacity for need and for arrival, reorient the moral mathematics of a house. You spend nights weeping for a child you have not yet met, and mornings in which the simple ordering of clothes feels like sacred work. As the day of our chosen announcement approached, I will not call it a reveal because we never agreed on a public script. We practiced the photos that would be taken. Not staged, we said, but arranged. We rehearsed smiles in mirrors until they lost meaning. The replacement stood near us in images like a punctuation mark. Necessary, and yet, to my eye, always slightly out of measure. On the morning we decided to tell only a small group of friends and our families, the house seemed for the first time in months solemn. We moved through the rooms with the ritualized calm of people who know they are about to enter a new ledger account. My wife wore the shawl my mother had sent. Its wool was soft and smelled faintly of the kind of lavender my wife liked. My mother did not attend. My mother sent a note and a bottle of wine with an annotation about the amount to set aside for the christening. We announced privately. She wrote an email to a short list of confidants who had been with us in easier times and in times of quiet misery. The replies came with the measured cadences of those who know how to respond to delicate news. Immediate congratulations from some, cautious offers of help from others. The social economy hummed, solvent and brittle. Sometimes I imagine the house as a kind of bank, cold vaults where memories are kept, and sometimes as a garden where mistakes can be planted and perhaps grown. The replacement, whose origin remains an ineffable notation on the back of our ledger, continued to be both account and person. He made mistakes and showed up with bandaged fingertips. He forgot keys and left them again where they might humorously be found. He learned the small music of our nights, the minute adjustments of a pillow, how to hold tea without sloshing, which stories to tell when a donor was present. He sometimes told a story with a small, childlike error at the end, and our guests laughed and forgave him as if they were in on a private joke. I do not want to suggest that this was an easy reconciliation. There were nights when I would wake with a ledger opened and the columns of my life askew, love on one side, resentment on the other. A man keeps such divides because either side can be defended. I added and subtracted, often without arriving at a final balance. Ledger, November 5th. Child moves in utero. Note, heart steady. Emotion, fear, fierce love. The pregnancy moved on. The house reconfigured itself around new needs. A lamp placed so she could read before sleeping. A low stool for putting on footwear when her back complained. A tiny shelf installed for the kitchen gadgets we had decided were no longer necessary. We constructed in the simplest way a space for a new life. Each act of furnishing felt like a small covenant. There came a night, late in winter, when the replacement made an error so distinctly human that the house itself seemed to exhale. I had left by accident a small glass of milk on the piano in the study when I went to fetch a book. He stood over it, perhaps to move it, perhaps to reach for something else, and knocked it. Milk spilled across the keys and ran in pale rivulets, making the instrument look as if it had been christened for some shabby altar. He did not pretend surprise. He bent and with both hands began to blot with a napkin. His fingers were clumsy. He made the wrong motion twice, and then, on the third try, found a way to press the napkin that worked. He muttered to himself in a voice that was not practice but puzzlement. I came in and watched him. There was no grand moment. He looked up and caught my eye with a certain apologetic frankness that made me close the book in my hand. The house felt full of small mercies. "Leave it," I said instead of scolding. "We'll call the tuner tomorrow." He nodded and smiled a smile that was not for any camera. It was the kind of simple human smile that knows its own smallness. We sat then for a long while in companionable silence, and, for the first time since the weeks of displacement, I thought of the possibility that the house could hold both the old and the new. It will not be easy. There are always debts to be accounted for. But the presence of a child softens some calculations merely by being hungry and warm and requiring attention. You cannot balance a ledger while feeding a child at 2 a.m. Practically speaking, the math breaks down, and what remains is practical love. My wife labored later than the dates predicted, and we learned patience in a way that is different from the patience one learns while waiting for a bill to be paid. This patience required small things, making tea at strange hours, holding a hand when a contraction rose like a wave, reading aloud from the ledger of nursery rhymes we had compiled as a joke, but now used because it sounded like a map. The hospital rooms smelled of antiseptic and something like hope. They were neutral places where the city's business could be suspended for the business of bodies. In the delivery room, the question of fatherhood, which had dogged us like a minor debt, was a quiet thing. There were forms to fill and names to write. We argued in the most practical way about which hospital packages to accept, about whether to have visitors. The nurse in charge managed the logistics with the weary efficiency of someone who had seen too many families become more or less legible under stress. When the child was born, if I may say born without the drama of heralding, it arrived into our life with a small, screaming insistence. The room received it as if receiving a new account book, blank pages, open margins. The child was small and red and immediate. I felt, in that moment, a flood of feeling that had little to do with social economy and much to do with body and bone. That first looking was not about paternity or legality. It was about the impossible immediacy of another breath. The nurse placed the child briefly on my wife's chest. She looked at the child and then at me with an exhaustion and an awe that made me forget to be jealous. We had made, through messy compromises, a new human being. The question of who would be recorded on the paper was still there. The solicitor's forms awaited our signatures. The camera took a discreet photograph, which we did not circulate. We argued briefly, not loudly, about what would be the most merciful line to draw on a piece of paper. My wife put her hand on the child's small head and looked up. "We will decide," she said, and in that decision there was a kind of mercy. She named no name then, and neither did I. The child's breathing measured time in a way that rings through the house, the soft in and out of small lungs that make all other accounts suddenly less precise. The replacement, who had been present in the room at the edges, as part of the peculiar domestic rotation, stood by and watched with a humility that seemed to have been earned. He touched the child's foot with a finger and winced when the small toes curled. He said softly, "If I am listed, I will be present. Whatever you need." His promise was simple and not contractual. It did not absolve the old erasures. It did not make the ledger neat. but it was offered in a form that was not a legal clause but a human thing, his willingness to attend. I could not tell even then whether the attendance would be sustained by affection or by habit, by a learned sense of duty, or a newly discovered tenderness. There remained for me a ledger of caution. We came home with the child, and for a while, the house reorganized itself more absolutely than in the months of preparation. Night duties were assigned in the practical way of parents: bottles, sanitation, observation notes. He, whoever should appear on whatever paper, sat awake at odd hours, his hand large over the small back, humming a tune that missed notes as though reciting from a memory with holes. Neighbors came with casseroles, friends with tokens, my mother with a carefully wrapped package and an envelope that held both money and a single line of writing. For continuity. The house accepted them with the stoicism of an entity that has always been asked to hold other people's hopes. There are nights now when the mirror lags in a funny way. It sometimes answers first with my face, then with the shadow of his, and then with the soft blink of our child's small, slumbering mouth. The pool sometimes takes a long time to return the terrace in its perfect outline. Sometimes it is precise, sometimes it hesitates. It has, in the end, kept to its rule. It does not invent. It only reflects. I continue to write, though my ledger is now more full of small felicities than of tests. My entries are not triumphant. They are careful and mixed. Ledger, February 11th. Child sleeps at 3:30. Tea spills. He blots the spill with a towel. Note: pity and gratitude recorded. Ledger, February 28th. Mother visited. Held child. Did not ask to see photographs. Note: small victory. Ledger, March 4th. He mispronounced the name we had finally chosen in public. We laughed. He apologized. Guests forgave him. There is mercy in these tiny mercies. There is also cost. I still read the photographs with a ledger eye. I still note where his hand rests and where mine does not. I still feel the occasional spike of jealousy if he performs a coda of affection in a way that seems rehearsed for a camera. But the child's breath changes the arithmetic. It makes the columns fuzzier, and there is a tenderness in that fuzz. When I watch him at night, sitting in the nursery with a cup of tea cooling on the table beside his chair, I sometimes find myself moved by a feeling I cannot wholly justify. Gratitude that the house, for all its trickery, has allowed itself to be softened. He misplaces a sock and grins. He sings the wrong word to a lullaby and kisses the child's forehead anyway. He returns, after a while, some of what had been lost to me, not to replace, but to add a different sum. The house keeps its counsel. It remembers how many times I have woken to the faint clatter of a kettle, to the way the candles lean when someone leaves the room. It stores the ledger of old resentments in the same drawer where it keeps the small, clean towels. Mirrors still do not always answer at once. Sometimes they lag and let a little forgery be visible. The pool still reflects with a sober fidelity that occasionally surprises us both. Its waters are not arbiters of truth, but witnesses who will not invent. There will be more entries. The ledger is not closed. We live in a house that has learned to host both the tidy life and the messy mercy of error. Our child will grow with photos and small scandals, and with the names we give it and the names we choose not to put on official lines. The question of origin will remain a quiet note, a footnote in the account that will sometimes be read and sometimes be left to gather dust. We do not pretend it is resolved. We only live with it, and that seems, so far, like enough. If you have been keeping this ledger with me, if the slow tally of small mercies and debts appeals to you, leave a note in the margin of your own life. Tell someone a small truth, or forgive a small thing. If you would like to hear another long, slow tale about houses and the way they remember, consider returning for it. There are more ledgers to be kept, and more quiet mercies to record.